It was supposed to be a routine cargo flight, nothing more than another early morning run out of Louisville's UPS Worldport, the busiest air logistics hub in the United States. Flight 782, a three-engine McDonnell Douglas MD-11, sat under the floodlights of the tarmac, its silver fuselage gleaming faintly against the dark sky. The crew had done this route countless times, moving overnight shipments bound for Dallas. The weather was calm, the forecast clear, and nothing suggested that this flight would end in disaster. At precisely 4:12 a.m., the plane lifted off from runway 17R, engines roaring as it climbed into the dark. For a few seconds, it looked like any other takeoff, steady, controlled, routine. Then, people living in the neighborhoods below began to notice something strange. A deep, uneven sound rumbled through the air, not like the steady hum of jet engines they were used to. Dogs started barking, windows trembled, and one security camera captured a flicker of orange light against the low clouds. Within seconds, the MD-11 began to lose altitude. Witnesses described seeing sparks trailing from the right side of the aircraft, followed by an enormous burst of flame. The right engine, heavy and blazing, tore loose from the wing. It spun violently before crashing into an empty shipping lot, exploding on impact. Debris scattered for blocks, and the smell of burning fuel filled the air. The rest of the aircraft, now lopsided and uncontrollable, banked sharply and dove toward the ground. At 4:15 a.m., 3 minutes after takeoff, Flight 782 slammed into an industrial zone near the airport perimeter. The explosion could be felt miles away. Fire crews rushed to the site, but the flames were unstoppable, consuming everything in minutes. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, the black boxes, were later found buried under twisted metal and scorched debris. By dawn, the crash site had transformed into a haunting landscape of wreckage. Pieces of fuselage lay scattered across warehouses and parking lots. The ground was blackened and soaked with fire-retardant foam. Reporters arrived within hours, their voices tense as they described a scene of utter devastation. UPS quickly issued a statement expressing deep sorrow for the loss of their crew and promising full cooperation with investigators. But as the sun rose over Louisville, something about the wreckage didn't make sense. Aircraft accidents were rare, and mechanical failures of this scale were even rarer. When engines detach mid-flight, there are usually signs long before, vibrations, warnings, or maintenance alerts that force a grounding. Yet, according to the flight's pre-departure paperwork, everything had been normal. The maintenance logs, signed just hours before the crash, listed no serious issues. Residents who witnessed the crash were shaken but puzzled. One truck driver, working a night shift nearby, told local news he saw the engine just fall off like it was never attached. Another described a flash, followed by silence, then a second explosion as the fuselage hit the ground. Investigators began combing the area where the engine had landed, measuring the distance from the main wreckage, nearly half a mile apart. It was clear that the detachment had occurred in midair, not upon impact. The NTSB launched an immediate inquiry, assembling teams of specialists to examine every fragment. Their first goal was to determine whether the failure had been caused by fatigue, improper maintenance, or sabotage. The MD-11 had a history of stability issues during takeoff and landing, but nothing in its design could explain why an entire engine mount had failed so suddenly. The recovered engine, or what was left of it, showed clear signs of mechanical tearing rather than explosion damage. Something had broken free, violently and unexpectedly. The tragedy claimed the lives of 3 experienced crew members: Captain Raymond Kessler, First Officer Amir Lano, and Flight Engineer Carla Dorsey. All were highly trained, with spotless records. There was no indication of pilot error. As investigators reviewed their flight history, one fact became unavoidable. The plane had undergone a major maintenance inspection just 12 hours before the crash. Someone had worked on it. Someone had signed the documents confirming it was airworthy. In the following days, residents laid flowers near the crash site, still in disbelief that such a catastrophe could happen so close to home. Television crews replayed the same haunting footage of smoke rising over the city, as anchors repeated the question that everyone was asking: how could an engine simply fall off a plane mid-flight? Behind the scenes, investigators began noticing inconsistencies in the maintenance logs. Small discrepancies, handwriting variations, altered timestamps, missing initials, all hinted that something might have been tampered with. The word vibration appeared briefly in the inspection notes, only to be crossed out and replaced with cleared. To most, it seemed like an ordinary correction. To the lead investigator, it looked like the first crack in a much larger mystery. What began as a mechanical disaster was starting to resemble something else entirely. A chain of deliberate actions leading to one of the most shocking aviation mysteries in Louisville's history. And the man whose name appeared at the bottom of the inspection report, Ethan Rourke, was about to find himself at the center of a storm that would shake the aviation world to its core. When the investigation into Flight 782 began, one name surfaced repeatedly in the maintenance logs: Ethan Rourke. He was a senior engineer with more than 20 years in the aviation industry, known around the hangar for his steady hands and quiet demeanor. Ethan had worked the night shift before the crash, signing off the final inspection report at 10:48 p.m., less than 6 hours before takeoff. To most of his colleagues, he was a man who kept to himself, a perfectionist who rarely made mistakes. Yet, as the investigators combed through the records, they began to notice the small imperfections that told another story. The first clue came from a routine checklist entry. In the maintenance log for Flight 782, there was a note about engine mount vibration detected during taxi test. Normally, such a note would trigger a more detailed inspection and possibly a delay in departure. But the record showed that the issue had been reviewed and cleared. The problem was, no one could find the follow-up inspection that should have accompanied that clearance. The section where the additional verification should have been recorded was blank, except for Ethan Rourke's signature. Investigators contacted him for an interview. He appeared calm, cooperative, and even confident that the cause would turn out to be mechanical. He spoke carefully, never defensive, but his answers were short and rehearsed. He explained that the vibration had been minor, likely due to a temporary imbalance in the engine's fan blades, and that it had been resolved after rechecking the torque values. On paper, it all sounded reasonable. But the problem was, no other technician on the shift recalled performing that recheck. When questioned further, Ethan insisted that the work had been done, and that perhaps the paperwork had simply been misplaced. It wasn't unusual, he said, for busy nights to lead to small administrative errors. Still, the investigators weren't convinced. They reviewed security footage from the hangar and found that Ethan had stayed long after his scheduled shift ended. At 1:27 a.m., cameras captured him entering the maintenance bay alone, long after the other staff had gone home. He left just after 2:40 a.m., carrying a small metal case and a folder under his arm. The footage raised eyebrows, but what made it worse was that the digital logs for that time frame were missing. The entire system had gone offline for 43 minutes. A gap that conveniently aligned with the time Ethan spent inside. The team began looking deeper into his background. On paper, he was qualified, experienced, and well-respected. But when they contacted a former employer, they uncovered something that UPS had missed or ignored. 3 years earlier, Ethan had been suspended for falsifying maintenance documentation at a smaller cargo airline. The incident was quietly settled, and Ethan was rehired after a brief performance review. The records of that case had been sealed, which meant UPS had never officially known the details when they brought him on. Co-workers began to describe him in a different light. Some said he was meticulous to the point of obsession, refusing to let anyone else touch his work. Others remembered him as secretive, even paranoid, often double-checking his own reports long after they were approved. A few mentioned that he'd been acting tense in the weeks before the crash, distracted, withdrawn, and often seen taking calls outside the hangar during his breaks. No one knew what he was discussing, but one mechanic recalled overhearing a fragment of conversation about payments being delayed. The investigators obtained a warrant to review his financial records. What they found painted a darker picture. Over the last year, Ethan had received several unexplained deposits from an entity registered under a maintenance subcontractor called Aerofix Industries. The amounts weren't enormous, a few $1,000s at a time, but they were consistent. The description on each transfer simply read, "consulting." When questioned about them, Ethan claimed they were side payments for freelance mechanical assessments unrelated to UPS work. Still, the timing of the deposits seemed too precise, often aligning with major inspections he personally approved. Aerofix Industries had a history of supplying replacement parts for UPS's MD-11 fleet, including engine mounts and structural fasteners. When the investigators traced one of the bolts recovered from the crash site, they discovered it bore a serial number belonging to an Aerofix part. one that wasn't rated for that aircraft model. The component's tensile strength was far lower than required. It was, effectively, a cheaper substitute disguised as the real thing. As the NTSB pieced these details together, the picture began to form. A subcontractor cutting corners, a maintenance engineer possibly paid to overlook irregularities, and a plane that disintegrated in midair because of it. Yet they still needed proof that Ethan Rourke had knowingly signed off on defective materials. The turning point came when an internal UPS auditor found an email thread stored in the maintenance database backup. It contained a brief exchange between Ethan and a contact at Aerofix. The message read, "Mounts approved. Standard clearance applies." Attached was an invoice marked Adjustment, March Shipment. The timestamp matched the date of the last major inspection for Flight 782. From that moment, Ethan was no longer just a witness in the investigation. He became a person of interest. His calm explanations now looked more like rehearsed deflections. His missing log entries and unrecorded midnight visits became evidence of intent. The investigation that began as a search for a broken bolt had turned into a hunt for a man whose decisions had written tragedy into the sky. Inside UPS headquarters, the mood was heavy and tense. The company's usually bustling operations center in Louisville was unusually quiet, with executives moving quickly between closed-door meetings. The crash of Flight 782 had drawn national attention, and questions from journalists were growing more aggressive with each passing day. In the middle of this corporate storm stood Linda Harcourt, the Vice President of Operations, a woman known for her sharp discipline and unshakable composure. Yet even she felt the weight of something darker. Beneath the surface, a sense that this wasn't simply an accident. Linda had been with UPS for nearly 15 years, and had built a reputation for managing crises with precision. When the first reports of the crash reached her desk, she moved swiftly, contacting the National Transportation Safety Board, coordinating with public relations, and reassuring board members that the company would fully cooperate. On the surface, she appeared calm, but as she reviewed the early investigation notes, unease began to spread through her. The name Ethan Rourke kept appearing, in maintenance logs, inspection forms, and now in the NTSB's early briefings. She didn't know him personally, but she recognized the pattern. One man connected to 1,000 small failures. By the end of the first week, internal auditors within UPS discovered something that made her stomach tighten. Several maintenance reports linked to Aerofix Industries, a subcontractor responsible for supplying replacement parts and performing periodic checks on the MD-11 fleet, showed irregular billing. The invoices were unusually vague, marked with generic descriptions like equipment upgrade or structural component replacement. The costs, however, were significantly lower than market value. That discovery led to a troubling question. Were Aerofix's parts legitimate? Linda ordered an internal review, bypassing the legal department to keep the circle of knowledge small. The initial findings were alarming. Some of the engine mount bolts delivered by Aerofix appeared to be made from an alloy that didn't match the material specifications approved by McDonnell Douglas. The company had essentially been supplying substandard parts that were visually identical, but structurally weaker. This revelation could ruin UPS's reputation, trigger federal penalties, and lead to lawsuits worth millions. Still, Linda needed confirmation before taking the matter to the board. She scheduled a private meeting with Marcus Delane, the founder and CEO of Aerofix Industries. Marcus was a man with an immaculate reputation, charming but notoriously secretive about his business operations. His company had grown quickly, landing lucrative contracts with several airlines, including UPS. During their meeting at a small conference room in Louisville, Linda presented her findings carefully, hoping he would cooperate. Marcus, however, seemed oddly defensive. He brushed off the discrepancies as clerical issues and claimed that the materials used were within tolerance. His words were smooth, but his eyes revealed tension. When she pressed him further about the alloy substitution, he changed the subject, offering to personally oversee all future deliveries to prevent confusion. A day later, Marcus Delane was found dead in his office at Aerofix headquarters in Cincinnati. The official statement called it a suicide, a gunshot wound with no signs of forced entry. His assistant told police he had been under immense stress following the crash investigation. But for Linda, the timing was too perfect, too convenient. The man who could have confirmed her suspicions was gone, and with him, any direct trail of evidence linking Aerofix to the use of counterfeit parts. As federal investigators descended on Aerofix's offices, employees began to talk. Several anonymously revealed that the company had been cutting corners for years, replacing expensive titanium parts with cheaper aluminum-based alloys imported from unverified suppliers overseas. To keep contracts, the documents were forged, and technicians were instructed to fast-track shipments for urgent airline orders. Marcus Delane had built his fortune on deception, and the crash of Flight 782 was the inevitable consequence. For Linda Harcourt, the revelation was both horrifying and personal. She had built her entire career on safety and integrity, yet a network of corruption had grown under her supervision without her realizing it. She began to wonder how deep the scheme went, and how many others inside UPS had looked the other way. Her biggest fear was that Ethan Rourke wasn't acting alone. Late one night, Linda sat in her office reviewing the recovered data from Aerofix's seized servers. Among the thousands of emails, one thread stood out. It was an exchange between Ethan Rourke and Marcus Delane discussing a revision agreement for a batch of MD-11 parts. The language was cryptic, referring to compatibility adjustments and expedited certification. But one phrase chilled her. UPS won't question it as long as you sign. The email was dated 2 weeks before the crash. She realized then that what had started as a mechanical investigation had evolved into something much more sinister, a corporate conspiracy buried beneath layers of forged documents and silent complicity. The media continued to call it a tragic mechanical failure, but Linda now knew better. Somewhere between Aerofix's greed and Ethan Rourke's compliance, an invisible line had been crossed, and 3 innocent people had paid the price. Still, there were things even Linda couldn't explain. A security officer who worked at the hangar where Ethan had done his last inspection vanished 2 days after being interviewed. His car was found parked near a service road by the river. The company's legal department quietly advised Linda to stop her independent inquiry and let the federal agencies handle it. But she couldn't let it go. She felt that she was standing on the edge of a truth so dangerous that everyone involved wanted it buried. And as she looked out her office window toward the runway lights glowing faintly in the distance, Linda Harcourt understood something terrible. This wasn't a single act of negligence. It was a system built on lies, one that might still be operating beneath her very feet. Weeks after the crash, recovery crews continued to sift through the blackened wreckage of Flight 782. Every piece of twisted metal, every scrap of wiring was catalogued and photographed. It was slow, painful work. The NTSB team focused their attention on the engine mount assembly, the crucial component that had failed mid-air. Among the debris, they found traces of corrosion and small cracks that had spread far beyond normal wear. It was evidence that the mount hadn't been properly reinforced during its last maintenance cycle. But the biggest clue came when investigators examined the flight recorders. The cockpit voice recorder, though badly damaged, was partially recovered. Technicians at the NTSB's lab in Washington worked tirelessly to extract any remaining audio. What they heard was chilling. In the final seconds before the crash, faint metallic groans filled the cabin, followed by a low-frequency hum that built into a violent rattle. Then, just before the explosion, there was an odd clicking sound, distinct and deliberate, almost like the shutter of a camera. The crew didn't have time to react before the cockpit erupted in chaos. When this recording was shared with the investigative team, it raised immediate questions. Why would a camera shutter sound be captured in the middle of a flight deck recording? No crew member had a camera listed in the inventory, and cockpit protocol forbade personal electronic devices during takeoff. The mystery deepened when investigators reviewed security logs from the maintenance hangar where the aircraft had been serviced. There, they noticed something strange. Ethan Rourke had entered the hangar at 1:12 a.m. on the night of the inspection, hours after his shift had ended, and stayed alone for more than an hour. The logs showed no reason for his presence, and the surveillance cameras for that period were conveniently offline. To confirm what happened during that missing hour, investigators obtained a search warrant for Ethan Rourke's apartment. The small one-bedroom unit in downtown Louisville was cluttered but orderly, filled with model aircraft and old maintenance manuals. Inside his desk drawer, they found a stack of USB drives, all encrypted. A cyber forensics team managed to unlock them, revealing a trove of digital correspondence, financial records, and photographs. The photos were startling. Close-up shots of engine mounts, torque bolts, and inspection panels from multiple UPS aircraft. including Flight 782. The timestamps match the hours when Ethan was supposedly off duty. Among the files was a folder labeled Aerofix. Inside were scanned invoices and encrypted emails between Ethan and Marcus Delane. The contents left little doubt. Ethan had been receiving payments to approve substandard parts, effectively covering up their use during inspections. The coded language in the emails, phrases like fast path approval and visual clearance, now made sense. Each payment coincided with an aircraft release after major maintenance, meaning that for at least a year, UPS planes had been flying with parts that should never have been installed. But there was something even more disturbing in one of the final documents. It was a digital photograph, heavily zoomed in, showing a set of engine mount bolts labeled Type 44A. Those specific bolts were known to be counterfeit, manufactured overseas and banned by the FAA due to multiple failures in stress tests. Attached to the file was a note from Ethan himself. Installed successfully. All records updated. The image's metadata confirmed the date. It was taken just 8 hours before Flight 782's final takeoff. When the NTSB confronted Ethan with this evidence, he initially denied everything, but once he realized how much they had uncovered, he changed his story. He claimed that Marcus Delane had threatened him, forcing him to sign off on the defective parts under the promise of continued employment and quiet bonuses. According to Ethan, he was just a cog in the system, doing what he was told. However, his bank records showed something else entirely. Not fear, but greed. The money transfers were consistent, calculated, and timed with precision. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the engine debris confirmed what the photos suggested. The bolts holding the right engine in place had snapped cleanly, sheared under stress they were never meant to bear. The cheaper alloy used in the Aerofix replacements had weakened after months of vibration. By the time Flight 782 lifted off, the mount was already seconds away from failure. The investigators now had a clear mechanical explanation, but it was the human motive behind it that made the case so sinister. Further evidence came from Ethan's encrypted messages. One email mentioned unlisted oversight, a phrase investigators later discovered referred to a hidden clause in UPS's maintenance, contracts allowing subcontractors to use alternate suppliers in emergencies. It was a loophole big enough to hide a crime. Whether or not upper management knew about it was still unclear, but one message stood out, a draft email Ethan had written but never sent. It read, "They'll bury this like the others. Nobody will believe it wasn't just a malfunction." By the time the NTSB finalized their midterm report, Ethan Rourke's name was at the center of every finding. He had approved the faulty components, falsified inspection data, and ignored multiple red flags. Yet the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't acting alone. The disappearance of Marcus Delane, the tampered security footage, and the convenient gaps in UPS's own digital records all hinted at something larger, a web of silence stretching far beyond one engineer's greed. Behind closed doors, whispers began to circulate among the investigative team that someone inside UPS might have been pulling the strings, someone powerful enough to keep secrets buried, even as wreckage still smoldered on the edge of the runway. And as they prepared to release their report, a new fear emerged, that Ethan Rourke, the man at the center of it all, was already planning his escape. The final report from the National Transportation Safety Board was released 3 months after the crash of Flight 782, and when it came, it stunned the aviation world. What began as a suspected case of mechanical failure was officially declared the result of deliberate human misconduct. The report laid out a grim sequence of negligence, greed, and deception. The right engine mount on the UPS MD-11 had fractured because the bolts securing it were counterfeit. They were substandard replacements made from inferior alloy material, installed during a maintenance cycle approved and signed off by Ethan Rourke. The failure began within minutes of takeoff, and by the time the plane reached 2,000 feet, the vibrations had escalated beyond tolerance. The engine detached, ripping through hydraulic lines and fuel systems, leading to the catastrophic explosion that followed. The names of the 3 crew members, Raymond Kessler, Amir Lano, and Carla Dorsey, were carved into the final page of the report as victims of avoidable mechanical compromise. The phrase was sterile, clinical, but behind it lay the full horror of human greed. The NTSB's findings triggered immediate outrage. Airlines and logistics companies rushed to review their maintenance programs, and Aerofix Industries was permanently shut down. Federal agents raided its facilities, uncovering an entire network of forged certifications and counterfeit part shipments. Yet the man most responsible for approving those parts, Ethan Rourke, had vanished. The morning the report was made public, police arrived at Ethan's apartment with an arrest warrant, only to find it empty. His car was discovered abandoned on a dirt access road near the Ohio River. Keys still in the ignition, wallet and ID left on the seat. A few footprints led to the water's edge, where the mud ended in a slick drop-off. Divers searched the river for days but found nothing. Officially, Ethan Rourke was listed as missing, presumed dead. Unofficially, no one believed it. Some thought he had fled the country, using one of the offshore accounts uncovered in his financial records. Others whispered that someone had made sure he would never talk. For Linda Harcourt, the release of the report brought no relief. The public saw UPS as a victim of corporate sabotage, but she knew the truth ran deeper. The emails, the forged invoices, the contract loopholes, all of it had been allowed to exist because of internal oversight failures. In her private notes, Linda admitted that she had been aware of minor discrepancies in the Aerofix contract months before the crash, but hadn't pushed for a full audit. She'd been under pressure from the board to keep costs down and cargo schedules on time. That knowledge haunted her. Every time she saw a UPS aircraft rising into the sky, she felt the invisible weight of the lives lost. The company quickly moved to contain the scandal. Publicly, they announced reforms, stricter oversight, and a renewed commitment to safety. Behind closed doors, lawyers worked to settle lawsuits quietly. Employees were told not to discuss the case with outsiders. But despite these efforts, rumors persisted that certain executives had known about the cheaper parts long before the crash. The Aerofix investigation revealed that several companies in the logistics sector had received similar components, suggesting a wide-reaching network of suppliers willing to sell low-grade materials to save costs. As weeks passed, strange details began to surface. A security guard from the hangar where Ethan had worked was found dead in his home, ruled a suicide. Another mechanic who had spoken with investigators abruptly resigned and disappeared from public record. When journalists tried to contact Linda Harcourt, her office declined all interview requests. She had grown increasingly withdrawn, and those close to her said she was struggling to sleep. Each year on the anniversary of the crash, someone left fresh white lilies at the memorial site near the airport fence. No one knew who placed them there, but many believed it was Linda. A quiet act of remembrance, or perhaps guilt. One evening, nearly a year after the tragedy, a retired NTSB analyst reviewing archived data noticed an anomaly in the encrypted files taken from Ethan's computer. Among the thousands of technical documents was an unsent message titled "For Release." Inside, it contained a single paragraph suggesting that Ethan had discovered that the substandard parts were still being ordered, even after Marcus Delane's death. The message ended with the words, "They'll keep flying until someone stops them." It was never sent, and no one could determine who they referred to. The file reignited quiet speculation that Ethan Rourke hadn't acted alone in that powerful. Individuals within the industry had orchestrated the entire operation. Some believed that after the crash, those same individuals ensured his disappearance to erase all traces of their involvement. Others thought he was alive, hiding somewhere, perhaps waiting for the right moment to tell his version of the truth. Over time, the story of Flight 782 became more than a case study in aviation safety. It became a cautionary tale about corruption buried beneath professionalism. The wreckage was cleared, the lawsuit settled, and new aircraft replaced the destroyed MD-11, but the questions never fully disappeared. When night fell over Louisville and cargo jets roared into the sky, people still remembered the morning when one fell, the moment the illusion of safety gave way to greed. And though the NTSB officially closed the case, some investigators never forgot the final unanswered mystery. Each year, they received an anonymous envelope containing a single photograph, a close-up of a titanium bolt engraved with the number 44A. No note, no signature, just the same part number that had doomed Flight 782. Whether it was a warning, a confession, or a reminder, no one could say, but it was enough to make those who opened it wonder if the story of Ethan Rourke and the truth behind the crash was really over at all.